Lena Vaughn never expected to inherit a farm, let alone one that was falling apart at the seams. But when her estranged great-aunt passed away, leaving her a small plot of land and a house that looked like it belonged in a ghost story, she had no choice but to pack up her life in the city and move to the middle of nowhere. She stood on the creaky porch, staring out at the overgrown fields, wondering what on earth she was supposed to do with them. A fresh breeze carried the scent of earth and wildflowers, but all she could see was work fences that needed fixing, a barn that looked like it might collapse any second, and a roof that had definitely seen better days. "You're new here," came a deep voice behind her. Lena turned sharply, nearly losing her balance on the uneven wooden step. A man stood at the bottom of the porch, hands in the pockets of his well-fitted jeans, his posture relaxed but confident. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had the kind of chiseled features that belonged in magazine spreads. His dark hair was slightly tousled, and his piercing blue eyes studied her with curiosity. "I guess you could say that," she said, brushing dust off her jeans. "Lena Vaughn, I had just inherited this place." "I know," he said, stepping forward. "Word travels fast in a small town." "I'm Preston Rhodes. I own the ranch next door." Lena frowned. She had barely been here for an hour and already people knew about her. She supposed it wasn't surprising. Small towns thrived on gossip. "Nice to meet you," she said cautiously, her city instincts making her wary. Preston glanced at the house, then at the fields beyond. "You ever worked on a farm before?" Lena folded her arms. "No, but I'll figure it out." He tilted his head slightly, as if assessing her. "It's not as easy as it looks." "I didn't say I expected it to be easy." His lips twitched, almost like he was amused. "Then you've got more sense than most people who think they can just walk onto a farm and make it work." Lena narrowed her eyes. "Are you here to welcome me or to tell me I'm going to fail?" Preston let out a low chuckle. "A little of both, I guess." He glanced toward the barn. "That roof won't last through the next storm," she exhaled, already exhausted just thinking about all the repairs. "I know. I could help," he offered casually. "I've got the tools and my ranch hands can spare a day or two." Lena hesitated. Accepting help from a stranger wasn't exactly her style, but she wasn't blind to reality. She had no idea how to fix a barn roof, and she certainly didn't have the money to hire someone. "Why would you help me?" she asked. Preston shrugged. "Because if your barn collapses, it's going to send debris onto my land. And because I don't like watching people struggle when I can do something about it." His answer was practical, but there was something about the way he said it that made her think he wasn't the type to stand by when someone needed help. "That's surprisingly generous," she admitted. "Don't get used to it," he said with a smirk. "I'm not in the habit of fixing other people's mistakes." Lena huffed. "This isn't my mistake, I just got here." Preston raised a brow. "Then prove you can handle it." She straightened her shoulders. "I will." He nodded once, apparently satisfied. "I'll bring my crew by tomorrow." And just like that, he walked back toward a sleek black truck parked at the end of the dirt driveway. Lena watched him go, feeling an odd mix of irritation and curiosity. Who was this man, really? And why did he care what happened to her farm? She would find out soon enough. Lena barely got any sleep that night. Between the eerie creaks of the old farmhouse and the weight of tomorrow's repairs hanging over her, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant hum of crickets. When dawn broke, she forced herself out of bed, made a quick cup of coffee her only luxury in this chaotic mess, and stepped outside onto the front porch. A soft mist clung to the fields, the air crisp with the scent of damp earth and morning dew. The land stretched far beyond what her great-aunt had left behind, blending into the neighboring property. Though she'd never admit it aloud, she was relieved Preston had offered his help. She wasn't foolish enough to think she could fix this place on sheer willpower alone. The rumble of an approaching truck pulled her from her thoughts. She turned just in time to see Preston's vehicle roll to a stop at the edge of her driveway. 2 other trucks followed, carrying a handful of workers who climbed out, stretching and chatting amongst themselves. They looked like they belonged on magazine covers for rugged outdoor living, broad-shouldered, sun-kissed, and effortlessly at ease in their work boots. Preston stepped out last, his presence commanding without him having to say a word. Dressed in a fitted black t-shirt and worn jeans, he looked more like the owner of a high-end ranching empire than a neighbor doing a favor. Lena crossed her arms, trying not to appear as uncertain as she felt. I didn't expect an entire crew. Preston's gaze swept over her, unreadable. Barn roof's not a one-man job. You want it done right. It takes more than just me. She swallowed her pride and nodded. I appreciate it. He didn't acknowledge the gratitude, just turned to his men and gave them instructions. Within moments, they moved with seamless precision, unloading tools, setting up ladders, assessing the damage. Lena watched in fascination, feeling both out of place and strangely captivated. You're not used to this kind of work, Preston observed, standing beside her now. She exhaled. Is it that obvious? He glanced at her hands. No calluses, and you look like you're thinking about 100 things at once instead of just doing the work. Lena wasn't sure if she should feel insulted or impressed by his observation skills. I didn't grow up on a farm. But I can learn. Preston studied her for a beat before nodding. Then let's start with something simple. Before she could ask what that meant, he handed her a pair of gloves and gestured toward a pile of loose boards that needed clearing. Think you can handle that? Lena pulled on the gloves, determined. Watch me. She spent the next hour hauling wood, hammering loose nails, and doing whatever small tasks Preston's men assigned her. It was exhausting but oddly satisfying. The sun climbed higher, beads of sweat forming at her temples, but she didn't stop. She was too stubborn to back down in front of Preston. Every now and then, she caught him watching her, not in a condescending way, but with something unreadable in his expression. When noon arrived, one of the workers called for a break. Preston pulled a cooler from his truck, tossing bottled waters to his men before walking over and handing one to Lena. She took it, twisting the cap open. Do you always work like this? Preston took a slow sip of his own drink. Like what? Like you own the place. Something flickered in his eyes, amusement maybe. I do own a place, a much bigger one with a lot more to manage. Lena leaned against the fence, catching her breath. And yet you're here. He considered her for a long moment. Maybe I like a challenge. She wasn't sure if he was talking about the barn or something else entirely. Before she could respond, one of the workers called Preston over for input on a structural issue. He walked away, leaving Lena standing there, unsettled by the way he got under her skin so easily. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of hammering, lifting, and reinforcing beams. By the time the sun dipped toward the horizon, the barn looked significantly less like a disaster waiting to happen. As Preston's men packed up their tools, he approached Lena once more. We should have the roof finished by tomorrow. After that, you'll need to think about the land itself. Lena wiped her hands on her jeans, already feeling the ache in her muscles. Right, because I have so much experience with that. Preston tilted his head slightly. You don't have to do this alone. She met his gaze, something in her chest tightening at the way he said it. I need to prove that I can. His jaw tightened, as if he understood that more than he wanted to admit. Then I guess we'll see what you're made of. With that, he turned and climbed into his truck, leaving her with a half-fixed barn, a long road ahead, and the lingering feeling that Preston Rhodes was far more complicated than he let on. The next morning, Lena woke with an ache in her muscles that she hadn't known was possible. Every lift, every hammer strike from the day before had settled deep into her bones, reminding her just how unprepared she was for this life. Still, she forced herself out of bed, stretching out the stiffness as best she could before heading out to meet Preston and his crew. By the time she stepped outside, the sky was painted with streaks of gold and soft pink, the air crisp with the lingering chill of the night. She spotted Preston near the barn, speaking with one of his men, his posture relaxed yet commanding. Even from a distance, it was impossible to ignore the way he carried himself like a man who was used to being in control. She approached, rolling her shoulders to shake off the soreness. Preston's gaze flicked over her, noting the stiffness in her movements, but he didn't comment on it. Instead, he gestured toward the barn. We should be able to finish the roof today. After that, you'll need to figure out what you're actually going to do with this place. Lena exhaled slowly, staring at the vast fields surrounding them. She hadn't thought that far ahead. Inheriting the farm had been unexpected, and up until now, her focus had been on simply holding it together. The idea of turning it into something functional felt overwhelming. Preston seemed to sense her hesitation. You don't have to decide everything today, but you should start thinking about it. A farm isn't just land, it's a business. And businesses require a plan. She glanced at him, surprised by the insight. You sound like you know a thing or two about that. There was something unreadable in his expression before he answered. I do. Lena studied him for a moment. There was more to Preston than he let on. He wasn't just some rancher lending a hand out of neighborly goodwill. He carried himself with an air of authority, a quiet confidence that suggested he was used to making decisions that mattered. Before she could press further, one of the workers called for Preston's attention. He turned without another word, leaving her standing there with more questions than answers. The rest of the morning was spent hauling supplies, reinforcing beams, and securing the last of the roofing panels. Lena threw herself into the work, determined to prove she wasn't just some lost city girl playing farmer. She refused to be seen as weak, especially in front of Preston. By midday, the last nail was driven into place, and the barn stood solid against the horizon. Lena took a step back, wiping the sweat from her brow as she surveyed their work. Preston walked up beside her, arms crossed as he inspected the structure. Not bad, he admitted. Lena shot him a sideways glance. I'll take that as high praise coming from you. He didn't deny it. Instead, he turned to his men, giving them a nod of approval before sending them on their way. As the last truck pulled out of the driveway, he lingered, his gaze settling on her once more. You need more than a barn, he said after a pause. If you're serious about staying here, you need to figure out how to make this land work for you. Lena sighed, rubbing the back of her neck. And how exactly do you suggest I do that? Preston considered her for a moment before responding. Start with what you have. The land is good, but it's been neglected for too long. You'll need to clear it, test the soil, figure out what it can support. Livestock, crops, something that makes sense. She frowned. And if I don't know the first thing about any of that, his lips pressed into a firm line, then you learn. Or you find someone who does. There was something in his tone that made her pause. It wasn't just advice, it was a challenge. Lena squared her shoulders. Are you offering to teach me? Preston held her gaze, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. I don't waste my time on people who aren't willing to put in the work. She lifted her chin. Good thing I'm not one of those people. A beat of silence stretched between them before he gave a slow nod. Then we'll start tomorrow. With that, he turned and walked back toward his truck, leaving Lena standing in the fading afternoon light, her heart pounding for reasons she didn't quite understand. She had come here expecting nothing but an old house and a failing farm. She never expected Preston Rhodes, and she certainly never expected that he might be the one person who could help her turn this place into something real. The morning air was thick with the scent of damp soil and fresh hay as Lena stepped out onto the porch. The sky stretched endlessly above her, washed in soft hues of pale blue, promising another day of hard work. She spotted Preston standing near the fence line, one boot propped against the bottom rail as he surveyed the land like he was already planning the day's battle. She walked toward him, the gravel crunching beneath her boots. He turned at the sound, his gaze sweeping over her like he was assessing whether she was ready for what was ahead. There was something about the way he looked at her, not just as someone he was helping, but as someone he was beginning to understand. They had spent the past few days clearing the land, working side by side until exhaustion blurred the hours. Lena had learned more about soil conditions, irrigation, and fencing than she ever thought she would need to know. Each evening she collapsed onto the porch, aching and spent, but something about the work felt like it was reshaping her. Preston had been relentless but fair. He expected her to keep up, to push past her limits, and she found herself rising to the challenge because failing in front of him wasn't an option. She stopped beside him, resting her hands on her hips. What's the plan today? He glanced at her, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly, not quite a smile, but something close. You tell me, Lena blinked. What? You want to run this place, then start making decisions. What's next? The weight of his words settled over her. He wasn't just guiding her anymore, he was forcing her to take ownership of it. She turned toward the land, her mind running through everything they had done so far. The barn was solid, the fencing had been reinforced, and the soil had been tested. They had cleared the worst of the overgrowth, but there was still a long way to go. She exhaled slowly. The southern field needs more work before it's usable. The irrigation system is old, and if we don't fix it, anything we plant won't stand a chance. Preston nodded, the approval in his expression subtle but unmistakable. Good. Then we start there. They spent the next several hours repairing old pipes, clearing debris, and ensuring the water flow was even. The sun climbed higher, sweat dripping from Lena's brow as she worked. Preston was beside her the entire time, never once stepping back to let her struggle alone. By mid-afternoon, she straightened, wiping her hands on her jeans. I think that's the last of it. Preston tested the system, watching as the water flowed evenly through the channels. He turned toward her, his expression unreadable for a long moment. Then, without warning, he reached out and wiped a smudge of dirt from her cheek, his fingers lingering just a second too long. Lena swallowed, her heart pounding from the simple touch. There had been moments over the past few days, small, fleeting moments where she felt something shift between them. A glance that lasted too long, a brush of hands as they passed tools back and forth. But this was different. She looked up at him, and for the first time she saw something in his gaze that was entirely unguarded. "You're not just doing this to prove something, are you?" he asked quietly. Her breath caught. "I don't know." Preston studied her for a moment longer, then stepped back, his expression once again unreadable. "Come on, let's check the fencing before sundown." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of work, but Lena couldn't shake the way he had looked at her. Or the way, deep down, she didn't want to. That evening, as the last streaks of sunlight faded beyond the horizon, she sat on the porch, nursing a cold glass of water. Preston had left an hour ago, but his presence still lingered, woven into the land, into the very fabric of the day's work. She was beginning to realize something she hadn't expected. She wasn't just falling in love with the farm. She was falling in love with him. Lena woke before dawn, the air still thick with the cool remnants of night. Her body ached, but it was a satisfying kind of exhaustion, the kind that came with progress. The past week had been a whirlwind of learning, adapting, and pushing herself beyond what she thought she was capable of. The farm was slowly taking shape, no longer just a collection of neglected land, but something with potential. She stepped outside, the sky still deep indigo, speckled with the last traces of stars. A light breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and hay. She was beginning to recognize these scents as familiar, comforting even. As she made her way toward the barn, she noticed headlights approaching from the distance. The familiar black truck rolled to a stop near the fence line, and Preston climbed out, his presence effortless as always. He didn't need to announce himself, he just belonged here, as much a part of the land as the rising sun. He was dressed in a dark Henley and worn jeans, his sleeves pushed up to his elbows. The quiet confidence he carried was something Lena had come to expect, but today, there was something different about him. A hesitation in the way he lingered by his truck before joining her near the barn. Lena wasn't sure what to make of it. They worked in silence for a while, checking the fencing and ensuring the irrigation system was still running smoothly after the previous day's repairs. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable, but there was an awareness to it, something unspoken settling in the air like the promise of an approaching storm. It wasn't until they finished securing the last section of fencing that Preston finally spoke. "You're different than when you first got here." Lena glanced over at him, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Is that a good thing?" His gaze held hers, unreadable for a long moment. "It is." She waited for him to elaborate, but he didn't. Instead, he gestured toward the fields. "You've got decisions to make. Have you thought about what you want to do long term?" Lena exhaled, looking out over the land. She had spent so much time just trying to hold everything together that she hadn't allowed herself to think beyond survival. But now, standing here, the reality of it hit her. This wasn't just a temporary project anymore, it was a future, a life she was beginning to carve out for herself. "I think I want to make it a working farm again," she admitted. "Maybe start small, focus on sustainable crops, see where it goes from there." Preston nodded, as if he had already known that would be her answer. You'll need resources. Investors, maybe. Lena frowned. I don't want to take money from strangers. You wouldn't have to, Preston said, his tone measured. She turned to him, studying the way his expression had shifted, guarded, careful. What are you saying? I could help. The words were simple, but they carried weight. Lena's stomach tightened. Preston, I'm not offering charity, he interrupted, his voice steady. I'm offering an investment. I know land, I know business, and I know how to make something like this succeed. Lena felt torn. She had spent her entire life trying to prove she could stand on her own, and now here he was, offering a safety net she wasn't sure she could accept. I need to do this myself, she said finally. Preston's jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded. Then I'll be here when you need advice. The words settled between them, an unspoken understanding lingering in the space they shared. As the day stretched on, they continued working, the tension easing but not disappearing. The push and pull between them was undeniable, but Lena wasn't sure she was ready to face what it meant. That evening, as the sky burned in shades of amber and violet, Preston lingered by his truck, his hands resting on his hips as he looked at her. You're not the only one trying to prove something, you know, he said quietly. Lena frowned. What do you mean? He hesitated, then shook his head. I'll see you tomorrow. And just like that, he was gone, leaving Lena standing there, her heart pounding with questions she wasn't sure she wanted the answers to. The following morning, Lena found herself awake before the first light of dawn, standing at the edge of the fields with a quiet determination settling into her bones. The weight of Preston's words from the previous night still lingered in her mind. You're not the only one trying to prove something. She hadn't pressed him on it, but the statement had stuck with her, burrowing into her thoughts like a stubborn root. Preston was more than the gruff, quietly commanding rancher she had assumed him to be. There was something deeper beneath the surface, something he wasn't saying. The hum of an approaching truck broke through the early morning stillness. She turned to see Preston pulling up, his expression unreadable as he climbed out. But there was something different in the way he looked at her today, an intensity, as if he had made a decision about something. Without a word, he handed her a cup of coffee, the warmth seeping through the paper cup as she took it. She hadn't even realized how much she needed it until she took a sip, the rich bitterness grounding her. They stood in silence for a moment, the early morning air thick with unspoken tension. Then Preston shifted, turning to face her fully. I need to tell you something. Lena's grip tightened around the cup. Okay, he exhaled, glancing out over the fields before meeting her gaze again. I didn't just end up here. I built my ranch from nothing, but before that, I was in a very different world. She frowned slightly, sensing the weight behind his words. I own a lot more than just land, he continued. I've spent years building businesses, investments, properties, things that most people don't see when they look at me. His jaw tightened. I walked away from a life of boardrooms and negotiations because I wanted something real. Something that wasn't built on numbers and deals. Lena's breath caught as the realization hit her. He wasn't just a successful rancher, he was something more, something bigger. She stared at him, her mind racing. You're not just a rancher, are you? Preston's lips pressed into a firm line. No, her pulse quickened. Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't want it to change anything, he admitted. People look at money and see leverage, power, expectations. I didn't want that between us. His voice softened. I wanted you to see me for who I am, not what I own. Lena swallowed hard, the truth of his words settling deep. She thought back to the way he had worked alongside her, never once using his resources as an easy way out. He had let her struggle, let her prove herself, even when he could have easily taken control, and now he was giving her the choice. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to meet his gaze. It doesn't change what I want to do here. I know. But it changes how I see you, she admitted. Because now I understand why you push yourself so hard. You're not just proving something to me, you're proving something to yourself. His expression shifted slightly, the guardedness giving way to something raw. Maybe I am. The space between them felt charged, as if they were standing on the edge of something irreversible. Then Preston reached for her hand, his touch warm and solid. I don't want to just help you with this farm, Lena. I want to be a part of it. Her breath hitched. Why? His fingers tightened around hers. Because I've spent years building things that never felt like home. He exhaled, his voice steady. But this place, it feels different, it feels real. Lena's heart pounded, the truth of his words crashing over her. This wasn't just about the farm anymore, it was about them. She stepped closer, her free hand resting against his chest. I don't need your money, Preston. I know, he murmured. That's why I'm here. And then, just like that, the tension between them snapped. Preston cupped her face, his thumb tracing along her cheek as he leaned in. The kiss was slow, deliberate like a promise. Lena melted into it, the months of uncertainty, of pushing and pulling, finally giving way to something undeniable. When they pulled apart, Preston rested his forehead against hers. I don't want to spend another day pretending this isn't happening. Lena smiled softly. Then don't. From that moment on, everything changed. They worked side by side, not just as partners in the farm, but as something more. Weeks passed, the land transforming under their hands. The fields flourished, the barn stood strong, and the dream Lena hadn't even known was becoming a reality. And through it all, Preston was there not just as the man who had helped build it, but as the man who had become her home. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, Preston led her to the fence line, the air thick with the scent of wildflowers and fresh soil. She turned to him, expecting another conversation about the farm. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Lena's breath caught. Preston sank to one knee, his gaze never leaving hers. I came here looking for something real. I didn't expect to find you. His voice was steady, sure. But now I can't imagine a life without you in it. Lena's throat tightened, her heart pounding. I don't just want to build a farm with you, Lena. I want to build a life. He opened the box, revealing a simple but stunning diamond ring. Marry me. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't hesitate. Yes, Preston rose, slipping the ring onto her finger before pulling her into his arms. The farm had once been just an inheritance, a burden she hadn't known what to do with. But now it was something more. It was home, and with Preston by her side, it always would be.